Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me, as always, is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's happening?
Hey Chris, another week, and good to be back in the grid, so to speak, after everything that's happened, and doing good. How are you doing?
I'm confused by what it means to be back in the grid. What happened that you were not on the
Ah,
grid?
you know what? That's an interesting thing. I should probably not use the word grid. That's a Swedish one when you say into the grit. So into the day-to-day life. But it was quite interesting. I read an interesting article because I guess we need to go back to energy sooner rather than later, and I have to go through this one. We talk about the energy transition on this show quite a bit. We talk about producing, we talk about storage, we talk about all this. But one thing that we obviously not part of this show is the consumption. And when it hits the fan that we need to do something, there was some interesting statistics coming out of the Swedish market recent week, where they looked at consumption on the southern part of Sweden, uh, taking into account the weather part as well. And the consumption has actually gone down 13%, which means that if you really put pressure on someone hiking the price, there is an abundance where we can actually start using energy differently as part of stop producing more renewable. I
So
just had to get out of my
your
chest. I thought it was
hypothesis
interesting.
is that the price of energy this winter is reflected in the demand slump and nothing to do with the economy.
True. But it's the price versus what you use is still
Yeah.
interesting, which I thought was an interesting part.
The other interesting thing I saw, there was a story in Pakistan that their grid had gone down. They're having some issues keeping the grid stable. So, some grids are on the edge, some grids aren't that stable. And so that was an interesting story because you don't hear about widespread outages like that very often. So
No.
that was a story I followed. But let's talk about what are we going to do today?
Well, I think the talking about grids going down, I think that's an interesting part. I hope what we're going to talk about today. I think this is going to be an interesting one because we're bringing in something that some people might start wondering: why are we bringing in a guest or more a company on an energy podcast that might not be always referred to as an energy company? So I think that's quite interesting to see in this energy transition and this convergence of industries to see who else is coming part of this and bringing value to this energy transition.
And the disclaimer, I did work for this company as part of my career as well. So unrelated to Johan inviting the guest to this podcast, but it's a happy circumstance. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how other companies are coming and looking at the energy problem and what they think they can do to help solve it. So why don't you bring our guest on board?
Absolutely. And then once again, we spoke too much in the beginning, as always. We get excited, but let's bring on the star of the show, Liana Jo Ault, Venture General Manager of Energy Innovation at Nokia. Welcome to the show. So
Well, it's
we always
fantastic.
start off the show with we know you. We've had some pre-calls, some pre-discussions with you. We did some research, of course, for the show, start looking at what you do, but our guest might not. So for our audience, who are you?
So who am I? So I am an passionate energy advocate, I guess you could say. I've got a really varied background, and typically my entire career has been around cutting edge technology. I've got an IT background. I've worked in the telecommunications industry for over 20 years, and 10 of that now has been with energy. And so I know that some people may think, well, wait, does that really equate to each other? But actually, the energy industry has been using some sort of telecommunications for decades. They've got a whole slew of radio engineers and now IT or network engineers that work on an IT network, an IP MPLS or an IP network, optical network. And so I made a transition about 10 years ago from a telecommunications carrier to energy, and I've never looked back. So now, 5 years into my career with Nokia, I've had the utmost pleasure to work with different power utilities globally and really specifically focusing on their challenges when it comes to communication solutions, new business models, how they're like making revenue. And now I'm working a lot more around energy transition and digital technology that can support that transition.
So help me understand when you say that, what that means. Are we just talking like Internet of Things and lots of devices out there, and you're still doing communications, or are you actually helping the energy company do something towards the energy delivery besides communications?
Yeah, so besides communications, let me qualify first though, Chris, because communications underpins pretty much everything that we need to do in the energy industry when we talk about transition. It's always there. And I used to tell people when I worked at the power utility, how are you going to get that data back? How are you going to talk that device? How are you going to control that? Even with the Internet of Things. Yes, it's kind of a buzzword. So we do have a lot of technology out there that we need to be connected to, but now we're talking about things like edge compute. We're talking about artificial intelligence for predicting and forecasting loads, for looking at weather forecasting and tying that together. So now what Nokia is starting to look at is, again, those edge applications. How do we create opportunities within our understanding of digital technology, edge applications, edge compute, different technologies around communications? How does that tie into the actual grid, and what can we do as a provider to support that transition? So we really are a support mechanism for the transition. It may be in your field area network. It may be at that edge compute piece where there could be some software that needs to belong to the edge that, again, is tied to some sort of means of cloud compute or communications. So it's really where we're trying to focus a little bit more, is on software. So my job in general with the venture incubator that I'm working on is looking at new software platforms and how they can help maybe with real-time data analytics on the grid. And that's a really interesting area, I think, right now to be in.
So when you talk about the grid, not the grid that I was talking about in the beginning, but the grid, when are we talking about? So we're seeing a development of microgrids, nanogrids, in conjunction, obviously, to the main grids around there. So are we? To help me understand a little bit in terms of when we talk about grids and the value you bring, where in terms of that respect.
Sure. So it's actually kind of at all levels, right? So if you look at it from just a telecommunications space first, right? So we have, a lot of times we're affectionately known as the third grid. So we provide optical communications for relay, for other things in the transmission grid. But where I focus really on that edge compute piece is in the distribution and the field area network. So think about it as, in the distribution grid right now, all these new distributed assets are being included, right? They're connecting. Sometimes they're islanded, sometimes they're not. So you have community microgrids, you have nanogrids that are behind the meter between solar storage inverter that's tying to now bidirectional wall boxes and EVs. Those are all going to tie into the distribution grid at some point in time. Those all need some level of compute and some level of communications in order to really look holistically at what's happening on the grid at any given time. So I think that we talk a lot about grid planning, transmission planning happens, and we see a lot of system operation, balancing those assets, that happens at the transmission level. And now, especially here in Europe, we're starting to see a transition from the distribution network operator standpoint to transition to participating in that balancing, which opens a whole nother can of worms around how the markets are designed. But I think that that's really where we start to see the scalability issues and how maybe Nokia can help with some of those scalability issues in taking in all that information and maybe balancing that at the edge with edge compute where it's necessary and where it's needed. And then just pulling back across your telecommunications what data you need in what, in what location, whether it's an internal cloud or whether it's shared with other entities. It's a big question.
And this edge compute that you're talking about, is this about actually doing compute at the edge, or is it about distributing the scale of the problem? Is it need to be at the edge, or is it just a way to get scale that you need to do?
A little bit of both. I think it's really going to be about the flexibility of being able to do either both.
Mm-hmm.
So there are going to be times, like if you look at an energy community, the idea of this energy community, which is actually really the construct now in Europe, and I think that you're seeing it in island nations and other places, is being able to balance that locally, right, between entities, between a microgrid user, maybe an industrial user, and the local community, and balancing the grid at that level in the energy community before it gets up the chain to the transmission level, right? So if you're looking at that, maybe there's some compute that needs to be done at the edge. One of the things I was reading this week was around Netherlands. One of the articles I found was in the Netherlands, they're looking at actually incentivizing large solar producers to not produce because there's so much solar going onto the grid from these nanometers and these highly distributed assets that is causing congestion in the distribution grid. How do we resolve that? And I think that you have to start looking at a different mechanism for balancing than what we've traditionally seen. And I think edge compute is one of the ways to do that.
There's a number of community kind of initiatives that have talked to some blockchain, some others that basically are helping that edge, kind of have a market, whether it's consumer level, maybe whether it's at the industrial level, before it gets into the traditional energy infrastructure that we would think of, right? So, we're in a community here. I've got surplus energy, like you said. I don't want to curtail the energy because that would just kind of be wasteful. So let's use it the best we can. So who becomes a customer of yours in that kind of a situation? Because that's kind of the community at large, right?
I think we're focusing on who the real issue is. And I'm saying you in Nokia terms, this is something we're looking at. We don't have product out there right now, obviously, that does this, but it's something that we are investigating or partnering with people to see how can we best serve in the edge compute piece and the communications piece. So I want to qualify that right now. But I think that when we talk about that, who is the customer? Well, you look at energy service providers are doing a lot of that aggregation, right? We have virtual power plants and energy aggregators that are now financially balancing what they need to do and what the excess capacity is. But for me, coming from a grid operator in my previous career before Nokia, I still have a passion and I still feel that the grid operator is really personally should be in control because they're the one that's responsible for the operation and the stability of the grid. Jan, you were mentioning earlier about, I guess it was you, Chris, maybe mentioning Pakistan and the article around the instability in the grid. That's still a grid operator's job. And so how do we balance? I think this is the key point is how do we balance the grid physically, financially, and still make it fair? When we start talking about curtailing congestion from solar, who's going to make the decision on who to curtail? If there's a financial incentive for me to feed back through my tariff, feed back into the grid, and now all of a sudden you're saying, no, we've got too much, I'm going to shut you off. Well, why are you shutting me off and not my neighbor? And so I think that, again, this is where AI, this is where streaming analytics is going to come in some sort of real-time control, is going to be necessary, really, to take a look at how do we do this in a fair and unbiased way. And I still think the grid operator should be the one that's in control of that because it's their requirement to keep the grid healthy and stable.
I think that you touched on something quite interesting because no matter what the technology, we can talk about AI and we can talk about, I like the way with someone that takes ownership of it. But at the end of the day, someone puts that algorithm in saying that we prioritize X, Y, or Z. And if you start connecting in terms of a microgrid as well, where you start getting the cars in there, you're getting the solar on the roof, smaller assets as well. This becomes a totally different kind of beast compared to what we have today for a grid operator. So how do we, as a grid operator, how would you manage this? Are you interested? Because suddenly there's a totally different setup than you used to.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that I've seen a couple of suggestions. I've doing the research and what I do because again, part of my job is keeping my thumb on the pulse of the industry. Even though I work in telecommunications company, my job is to be an expert in the energy industry. And I think that there are some new ideas around. We're used to, in the traditional sense of the world, the grid works in a very linear fashion. You generate in large central, and I'm sure this is not anything new for your audience. You generate these large centralized generation plants, and then you transmit that at a high voltage level, and then you distribute that, and then you deliver it. And we did disaggregate retail from generation from the grid operation, but now it's a much more circular kind of or like a hub and spoke. And I always go back to my telecom roots because I think about this from the difference of maybe an optical network, which is very linear, or way back, and I'm not even going to mention some of the old networks that I know that are very linear. But now you're looking at a much more Ethernet-based grid where everybody's trying to talk at the same time, and you have to somehow have controls in place to say who can put on when and how you do that. real-time digital twinning. I mean, I kind of use that word lightly because how do you do that in real time? And typically when we think about a digital twin, we're thinking about bringing all this information back to a cloud environment and creating this beautiful picture of everything. But is that really what we should be doing? There's so much information. If you start thinking about every house, every EV, every microgrid, that's a lot of data to be pulling back into a cloud. So is there a way that we can make those decisions at the edge and only bring back maybe what we need to bring back to the cloud for historical purposes or for trending? And we can do that at a time when maybe it doesn't affect and overload communications.
We're looking at a new energy landscape, and we're looking at all the different devices that will be connected to this new energy grid, if that's a microgrid or is that. So how does this play out between the existing grid operator and the new one? What is the role for this one, and how will they be managed? You talked about the AI integration in terms of this. For me, AI is today more of an algorithm, and who decides priorities, etc., because this is a new situation for everyone. So what are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, so what's interesting about the whole energy transition when we start thinking about the new feed-in tariffs and the private investment, a lot of the regulations that are put into place, and I know the U.S. has just adopted new regulation. Australia is looking at new regulation to enable new private investment, and the reason for that, or what the result is now we have feed-in tariffs, and who decides, as you're alluding to, Johan, who decides when there's congestion like they're having in the Netherlands right now? Who decides when to turn off which producer, which independent producer or prosumer that's feeding back into the grid? And I think that when it comes to the responsibility, who's really responsible for maintaining grid stability, that's the grid operator. And in my mind, even though the energy service providers, and if you look at a lot of these new VPP platforms or these new flexibility management platforms, they're really geared towards demand flexibility, and they're being implemented and served to the consumer by energy retailers, right? So and that makes sense because they're having to hedge their forecasting, their consumption, they're hedging their markets and things. But when it comes to that congestion, that's really the grid operator's responsibility. And in certain areas, there's a penalty for not maintaining the reliability of the grid. So in my mind, it is a combination. But those grid providers really need to have the capability of curtailing that solar or that wind or tapping into that flexibility from the battery when it's necessary. So in my mind, and I think again, that's come from my power utility background. I've not been an energy retailer, but I've been in that operations, I've been in the operations field, and I understand what that means for them when there's an outage. So for me, I think that there's going to be a new kind of take on what the grid operator's role is, and they're going to have to start looking at that. We talk about the transition in Europe now from a distribution network operator to a system operator. So again, that balancing authority. And maybe I've seen some suggestions that there needs to be perhaps a distribution balancing market at that level so they can do the clearing of those requests from the energy service providers before they go into the transmission network. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens. For me, though, that's in my mind, that would be my perfect customer, right? That they would be the ones that have the control and can group those portfolios. They can look and balance across those smaller areas in order to maintain the grid stability like they need to.
Today, if I look at, let's say, North American grid, like FERC and others would basically regulate how that goes, and you have a bid system that's very well defined, but it may take place in 15-minute intervals or something as opposed to nanoseconds or in near real time. So is the problem statement in your mind being able to do this in near real time? And I say near real time as a computer person, it would appear like real time to me if I'm looking at the screen, but is that the problem, doing this at scale? Because I don't think there's anything fair about the way the grid works right now. It's regulation. It's designed to either have a base load or you're designed to have a certain outcome that the regulation tried to come up with, right? It doesn't mean that that's what they got, but that was why they got to where they got. You want to have my coal plant go on, or my wind, or give a nuclear plant some bias to be there so it doesn't go away for base load. What's the problem statement that's different here? Is it it's just the speed, the velocity, the scale?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of, I think it's speed and scale, right? So I think, well, in a couple of ways, you have the intermittency problem with renewables, right? The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. You have this issue of curtailment and large plants. So, for example, they just put out a report that in the UK we curtailed enough wind in 2021 and 2020, I believe, to power 800,000 homes to the tune of 507 million pounds, GB, British pounds sterling. That much curtailment, that's what it cost. And so that's a lot of loss of renewable generation because we didn't have the infrastructure in place. So when I talk about scalability, I'm thinking about massively distributed assets. Again, we go back to the private investment and the incentive for private investment and deregulating this, like they're starting to look at in Australia, 2025, the ESB there, the Energy Security Board has looked and making recommendations to allow private investment, which means prosumers, it means independent producers being able to add into the grid. So I think that when you look at scalability there, that's the other issue is you're going to have so many different people. I think the forecast for the number of homes with solar in Europe by 2030 is 70 million homes. So how do you regulate, how do you orchestrate and maintain reliability in the grid when you have that many homes that are trying to feed back into the grid?
So I may not be the brightest light bulb in the box, but I'm trying to figure out that 500 million pounds. How would the system you propose get that energy used? How would that not be a waste? So you've got sun or a windy day or whatever the event is that's generating plenty of energy.
Yeah.
Um, is it just the order things are shut down? You're just saying, hey, we just won't have any coal plants. We're not going to have any conventional plants running today at this juncture. Or like, how would that, other than storage of the electrons, I'm not quite sure, or
Yeah.
converting it to a molecule, how would that not still be a problem?
So I think it goes back to what the business model looks like, right? So we're used to having these really large offshore wind plants that really create what we would consider replacing baseload. I'm using air quotes around baseload because we know that that's not really, is intermittent. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a big push to look at local generation where it's consumed because otherwise, and I think we will still have to invest in grid. The grid operator is always going to be important. And I think that when you look at the amount of investment we have to put in transmission grid to be able to take all that North Sea wind generation down to the southeast here in the UK where it's consumed, that's a long-term project. It's a lot of steel. It's a lot of work and a lot of rights of way and everything else that needs to be planned. And I know that that's something that the grid operators are looking at and they need to do because we still need that. But I think to offset that it's a multi-answer to your question, Chris. So I think with that, they're looking at things like hydrogen and to be able to store that, right? But there's another layer at the distribution layer where we can take advantage of that private investment. We can take advantage of those local generation assets, local microgrids, local solar, and the storage, the EVs, where that will actually resolve some of the issue in the distribution network. But again, that's the scalability issue. Now you're looking at, as I mentioned, 70 million homes, 6.8 million public charge points that can, and not to mention how many bidirectional EVs could be here in 10 years. Now you're looking at the scalability issue, right? Now, how do you manage those number of devices in order to make them, optimize them and make the most efficient use of that? So are we really using the renewable energy we're creating in an effective way? And sometimes I have to say, not always.
But how does this work? And I'll continue. This is part of the show, asking the stupid questions, and I'll see if this is one of them. But
we both excel at this part.
But you start looking at, as we mentioned, there's a number of new assets coming in. So the distribution model is changing. Might not change in a day or two, but for sure you will have electric cars with your batteries. You will have solar. You will have in-house batteries. You will build nano microgrids in different societies. Some of them want to be self-sufficient, both for supply, but also for pricing. What then becomes, because you mentioned the importance of the grid operator to making sure that we have a stable grid. So we're privatizing probably the rest of it, and we might centralize something around the grid. What becomes the role of the grid operator? And in this business case, who owns this?
Yeah, so for me, I think the grid operator is the balancing authority in a lot of ways, right? Or the balancing responsible party. They need to make sure that this happens. But I guess when I think about this in my own head, and again, I'm going to qualify right now, I'm not an electrical engineer. So I've spent a lot of time around them and a lot of time around very brilliant people. And I didn't go into electrical engineering for various reasons, but I do like to chew on these problems once in a while and try to assimilate some of the knowledge I've learned from some experts in the fields. So when you look at this hierarchical level of balancing the consumption and the production, right? If you're a prosumer, the first thing you really should do is balance your own home, right? You should use as much of your energy or store as much of your energy as possible before you feed back into the grid. That's the first level of in this hierarchical model of balancing. And then look at your neighborhood, right? So this goes back to what we're talking about with peer-to-peer trading or some sort of frame there. Is that possible to utilize on the same grid, utilize this model where I can share those excess resources or capacity across both financially and physically. Physically, there's some other things that go along physically which make it more difficult. But the idea is, can you then make this new neighborhood level of balance, balancing the physical and the financial in that neighborhood before you move on to a region? And I think that when you start looking at how, if we would adopt some sort of a hierarchical model like this, the role of the grid operator now becomes much more, in my mind, much more important because they know what their infrastructure can take and they can group those portfolios, so to speak, in a way that would be most beneficial to the infrastructure. And then again, there's got to be some sort of algorithm that's going to have to say, here's my priorities on how I balance. Maybe it's a round robin, maybe it's a time of day, maybe there's brand new tariffs now that people can sign up for to say, I just want the cheapest price, I don't care, and let the grid operator control what's there, or a new service that they can offer to these people.
I definitively hear the telecom IP background in the description of the problem statement, right? You can see how the analogy is. And having spent part of my career in telecommunication, I see the analogy with one major difference. So the one thing I appreciate is scale is hard. I said this on our pre-call. Doing anything in the millions or hundreds of millions gets hard, and doing it well, right? So it sounds easy, but scale, it's hard. But the other thing that's different is in telecommunications, the Mother's Day phone call problem is okay, right? So I build so much capacity. I can push stuff out to the edge. I can, or the Ethernet example you said, I can contend for a resource. But at the end of the day, for power, I can't shut a hospital down. I mean, they have generators and they'll last for a period of time, but the air quote base load you think is the base that we need, right? So it's a little bit different than networking where, I'm okay if a Christmas morning I can't call and say thanks and I have to wait a couple hours and try again. Probably not so if I'm freezing Christmas morning in my house.
Exactly.
So it's a slightly different problem statement. And so what nuance or what difference do you guys have to look at from your point of view to solve this problem?
Oh, that's a really loaded question, I think, Chris. I think to solve the problem, I think, again, like I said earlier, there's multiple levels to this, right? If you ask some people, they'll say small fusion reactors, neighborhood reactors, that's going to solve your baseload problem. So you always have that there. Other people say, there's a lot of work around interconnects, building more interconnects between all of the countries in Europe to make sure that we can maintain that baseload. I don't know that I have the answer necessarily to that.
I'm not expecting the answer. I'm just looking at the problem statement because it seems
Yeah.
very analogous at face value. It seems like, yes, we did this with IP, we did this with routing, we did this with hierarchical, we did, and you can look at OSPF or some other protocols and say, okay, well, we do these different things. Cool. All works great. But the difference is if there isn't service, it's
Right.
less life threat. I mean, yes, when I did voice, we had lifeline services and there was
that's been a
difference.
while. Yeah.
Yeah, different stuff, right?
Yeah, I think so. But I think again, it's going to come to how do we invest? And I really do think I've got two kids that are in their 20s, right? So they're Gen Zers, and what I'm noticing with the Gen Zs is that they are interested in investing in what is outside their door. They're very community centric. They're very driven to say, I want to see where my money's going. They're not afraid to step up and say and call people out, call politicians out, call companies out to say, no, I don't like the way this is working. And I say that because I understand what we're saying here about needing that baseload and needing large generation. I think that we'll always need that, especially because we have heavy industry that's going to be required It's going to require massive amounts of energy, and that's always going to happen. But I think when we start looking at energy communities and having those, investing in small, whatever they are, whether they're small microgrids that are clean, and again, that's a whole nother problem statement, is greening up what we call a microgrid. But when we start talking about how we work and how we invest, and investing in those types of technologies, whether it's thermal storage, whether it's load shifting, those types of flexibility where you can start managing again your demand, maybe it starts evening some of these things out where we have these intermittent peaks. But I don't think there's a one cookie cut thing that's going to say this is going to solve everything that's wrong in the grid right now. I don't, it's never been that way, and I don't think it's going to ever be that way. There's going to be multiple layers to this approach, and it's such a complex beast. And yes, there's definitely IP background, for me and how I approach these things. It is kind of fun to look at things and compare the differences between the two, which has made my background, I think, kind of unique. But let's just face it, it's, the grid today is not built for two-way flow like full duplex communication is in a communication network, plain and simple. So there's still a knowledge gap there. There's certain things that we have to learn. But I do think that investing in local sources and even partners, so funny enough, public-private partnerships, right? So when you start looking at these energy communities, what role can an industrial play? Maybe there's an industrial or commercial that's located closely to them that they want to have their own green reputation, but they can overbuild their microgrid and their storage, and maybe they can help offset that in that local energy community to help solidify or to help basically with that base load that they need and supply that somewhat. So there's, I think, several ways that could be solved, or at least remedied, not completely.
Now, and I like this, and I think you're also in a position which I'm kind of envy as well, to be on the edge to see, what are we developing and kind of this new technologies and integrating them, which I think is fascinating. But one thing that strikes me sometimes when we talk about, and especially on this show as well, we talk about all these new opportunities. And I totally agree with you. This is not just for energy, it's food, everything to bring it local, maybe from being extremely global in the last 10, 20 years. But we're also on a time schedule. We start looking at, we need to do this by 25, by 30, by 40, by 2050. So is there in your discussions on scale with utilities and other stakeholders around this, is there a challenge here when it's not concrete? There's too many challenges in building this one, rather than say, we'll do what we always done, but we'll just invest and build 10 more new nuclears in France and we'll be done. We don't have to do it. We have the infrastructure. So this whole thing about adding all the extra on it is not worth it. So how do we make sure? Because I'm a big believer that's not the solution. I think we need to do this on integrating the prosumers, start producing locally, start using renewable energy to a greater extent. But if it comes push to shove, is it easier than just put the money into a proven technology and go with it?
Well, I think so. I'm not gonna pick on nuclear too much because I'm a fan of nuclear, but
it was probably a bad example.
But if you think about the time, and it goes back though to what we were talking about with the infrastructure, right? How long would it take an infrastructure company to build, or a grid operator to build the necessary transmission infrastructure to all the locations that they would need? From a wind farm, a very large wind farm, all the way down to where it needs to be delivered. That's probably a 12-year project, if I had to guess. And again, I'm not a transmission planner, but I've seen some projects that are large that have taken at least that long. And there's so much that goes into that with civil engineering, again, and rights of way and things like this. So I think the fastest way to get there is to engage private investors at that local level. And I think that if you've got the right technology on top of that, and that's going to take lots of different companies working together. One service provider, let's just say that, and I'm saying about technology service provider, I don't think that one service provider will have the entire end-to-end solution. I think you're going to see a lot more collaboration between companies to solve this issue, where we may be the technology and the communications giant that knows how to do this and guru there, but we don't have maybe all of the energy information, power flow modeling, and things like that we need to have to help solve that problem. So I think you're going to see a lot more collaboration already in this space, when you start looking at these types of platforms where they're doing flexibility management, they're doing some of this what I affectionately call orchestration. There are so many startups and small companies that are maybe past seed funding and they may be in Series A. There's so many companies out there that are getting, there's a lot of merger and acquisition activity right now. So they come up with a great idea, they've got this niche of the market, and then they're going to get snapped up by another one. Or I've seen a couple where they've got a good idea, they have part of the puzzle, but then this other one has something that's a little different piece, and they're merging in order to create a more complete product. So I think it's just such a buoyant market right now in that space from an innovation perspective that you'll see a lot more of that collaboration. But back to the actual question, I think that in enabling the private investors to feed back into the grid and then making sure that the grid operators are properly funded in order to build that grid. Most grid operators, DSOs that I know, DNOs here in the UK and even in the US, if you look at their operating margins, they're tiny. They're so small because they're regulated. And I get that. But that grid is not going to go away. That grid is still going to need to be there, even if you're looking at multiple energy communities that are tying together. Otherwise, I don't think you're going to have the stability and the reliability and resiliency that you need from the grid unless, and we start looking at these local resources, right? I think that's what we're going to end up is each one of these distribution network operators will become a distribution system operator that's now balancing between these local energy communities, taking advantage of private investment. Taking advantage of the private investment that occurs there.
How much of the current problem statement you just described, you talked about a lot of investment, is still lacking because of regulation and technology? Because I get there's a lot of startups, and I get there's a lot that could get put together and do some pretty amazing things. There's all kinds of innovation all over the place we're seeing. So I don't know that that's the hurdle. Is regulation or is community support? What's been slowing this down, right? Or is it just straight economics? There's no tax dollars or public funding to make this happen, or what's the gate?
I think there's two things. Number one, a lot of regulation is already in place, right? In the EU, there was some regulation that was passed in 2019 to allow private investors to participate in the open market. I think they passed something, I think it's Work Directive 2222. They've passed in the US to help spur on private investment. So I think that the regulation's going the right direction, but it's really easy. It's easy to say, we're going to allow this, but not really give you the right mechanisms to do that or the right funding, right? So when we talk about grid operators, how they invest is extremely important because it goes back to how they're funded, right? And I've seen working in the US, I've seen across the board, I've seen very, very progressive utility commissions in states, and I've seen very public utility commissions that are very laggard in how they adopt and how they fund. So I think it is part of it, but I also think it's speed of adoption. This is not an easy thing to do, to transition from a network operator to a system operator, and it also is going to require redesigning of the markets, right? So if you're an open market and you're used to selling and clearing your markets at the TSO level in 30-minute increments, it may goes down to 15, and now we're talking about 5-minute intervals. So now you've got technology that needs to be able to trade in these faster intervals, and that means understanding your forecasting and your algorithms. And I kind of laugh, and internally we talk about, and I think that people who are in the tech industry can understand this. It's been the battle of silicon for a long time, right? Whoever has the best silicon will win. And now it's going to be the best silicon, but it's also going to be the best algorithms. Who has the best algorithm? Who can predict and forecast the best? Who can understand what's happening the best in the industry right now? Who's got that platform that really gives you that real time, and who can make faster decisions based on better information, where you got your information, etc. So I think that it's really going to be, the tech is there, but it needs to improve. The adoption needs to improve. And then I still see between telecommunications and energy, there's some standards difference. That's really interesting. When you look at the standards that telecommunications uses, and I'm talking about like when they're doing power and things, B locations and things, but you compare that to what the standards are that the power utilities use. they're different. The protocols are different, and there's going to have to be some kind of a marriage between those standards for easy adoption. So yeah, I think that that's probably a long-winded answer to you, Chris. But regulation is there, it's adoption cycles, and it's funding for the grid operators.
And I think it's fascinating, and I really enjoyed the discussion. I know we're coming up to time, but I can't help myself. I still have one or two more questions I need to follow up on. But I think this whole transition, and this is why we started the show to talk about it's changing. Otherwise, it's quite boring if it isn't, and that brings a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges. Maybe one last kind of, not a question, but maybe your thoughts around it. You work with ecosystems. You mentioned that in the beginning. You're one part of multiple partners that's going to make this happen. Coming back then also to Chris' analogy between telco and energy, whereas it could be down for a period of time, it's okay, but energy, it's not. So how do we balance this from having a great new technologies, a lot of new startup companies, we have small scales, all of this one, but who will actually own the responsibility for me as a customer when something goes wrong? And we've had this in terms of a few other things. We have the pipeline in the US where kind of everyone that went down for a bit, and everyone blamed it. Now it's infrastructure. Now it's a utility one. It's edge. So how do we ensure for the end user, our customers, us as private people, the factories that needs to work, that no matter how much we fund this with private money, how much we decentralize this, it will work?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, Johan, I probably would not be on your podcast right now. What I have seen, and I've been doing this for a while now, is that everyone now, this new generation, in my generation, I guess, our generation, the three of us are probably close in age, it's about education. For example, and energy security. My household has been looking at procuring storage and maybe backup generator because we want to know that we have that security, right? Not everybody can do this, right? I would love to see schemes where they're supportive of people. They're more support for private investors to help people who maybe don't have the means to do that, or the real estate agents or the owners, right? The people that own the buildings. But I'm seeing a very, very big increase in educating people on really how the grid works. And this is something that I'm so passionate about. Our system operator asked for the last 2 days that we would curtail our energy use between certain hours in the evening, between 5 and 6 p.m. the first day and between 4:30 and 6 p.m. the second day, because they knew that we had low wind and that we were going to have a big demand between those times. So there was an announcement on the radio and on the news and everything else, hey, can you do this? I can't wait to see what happened. Here they always talk about, you can see during the middle of the football match, you always know when it's halftime because there's a spike when everybody turns on their tea kettles for tea. And if consumer behavior is such that way that we just start to make it part of our daily life. And I've talked to some companies who've had the ideas around educating through gamification even. So you're providing an app for users in the household that can gamify energy efficiency. We've been talking about that for a long time, and sometimes it's a pass-through to offer those services. But I think more and more, because of the interest in climate change and what I can do to eliminate or to reduce my carbon footprint, that the education of the consumer and how this works is going to become better and better and better. So I think that we will start seeing the consumer take responsibility for their own piece. The other piece I will say is I grew up on a farm. My grandparents were on a farm, and my grandmother had, unfortunately, a lung disease that she was on an oxygen condenser for the last 7 years of her life. They had outages sometimes that lasted for 3 days in the wintertime because of the snow. So they bought a generator specifically to make sure that she had oxygen that she could live. And I think that we will start seeing houses that have this built in, and that if we can come to a standards, a level of standard implementation of every new home, every retrofitted home needs to have XYZ. They need to have a heat pump, they need to have an inverter, they need to have solar, they need to have storage. If we get to that point where society sees that as a standard install, then we start solving some of those issues. But there's a long way to go for that. But I think we're headed the right direction if the grid operators can get engaged and really help educate the consumers.
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. I think, some of the challenge that we see with the energy transition is for storage or other things in your home. The socioeconomics play a factor, or if you're multifamily, right? So if you're in London, there's a lot of multifamily, or where you might be. Because I think, as with most things with the energy transition, the better you are socioeconomically, the better you can weather it. You can move away from somewhere that's flooding. You can put battery jack up, or you can take your car and have two-way charging off an EV sooner. I think there's other plans to get there. But what I was happy to hear is your optimistic outtake that you think that people will step up and will get there. I want to thank you so much for coming on the program. I've enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully we weren't too grueling with our questions, but it's been a fun conversation and a fun journey. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. I love talking about energy. And like I said, I may not be an electrical engineer, but I'm pretty passionate about it, and I've spent some time here. So it's always good to talk to other people. And I can't wait to hear any comments that your listeners have.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this podcast as much as we've had. It's been a pleasure making it. If you are not already following us, please follow us, like it, subscribe, share it with your friends. And as our guest already said, put comments there. You're going to get comments back. So don't be afraid to comment on our YouTube channel, or comment on one of our social media channels, or just simply under the podcast. We look forward to speaking to you again next time. Bye-bye.